But it's a period that we're entering into of greater risk. And the main thing I would emphasize, I think that gold should be part of the portfolio. Gold is an alternative money. In fact, it is the third largest reserve currency after the dollar and the euro and ahead of the yen. In history, in my history of playing markets for 50 years or so, some of the times that I was surprised because the things that happened never happened in my lifetime. And when I studied history, I found they happened many times in history. So I studied the Great Depression, 1930 to 45 period, and I, because of that, had a systematic way of dealing with the economy when we got into depression-type situations, bad situations that helped us a lot in the 2008 financial crisis. And so 3 important developments are happening now that prompted me to do the study, which led to the book that I wrote, which is Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. Those 3 things are an enormous amount of debt creation and the monetization of debt, magnitudes not reached except for the 1930 to 45 period. Also, internal conflicts. Populism of the left and the right never happened in developed countries through my lifetime, caused by the largest wealth and values differences, irreconcilable differences, perhaps, that could lead to a type of civil war. I'm not saying necessarily guns and shooting, but I am saying a type of civil war, and certainly is leading to great conflict and dysfunction in government, not just in the United States, but other places. And the third great influence, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, through a cycle, there's a war, dominant powers win the war. This was in 1945. Then the new rules of the game are established, particularly by the dominant power being able to establish them. And then there's a period of peace and prosperity. And then with time, other countries come along and become competitor, such as China has come along and become a competitor. So there are also 2 other factors that I found. I call these together the big 5. The other factor, number 4, is acts of nature. Droughts, floods, and pandemics have throughout history actually caused more deaths and toppled more orders than the first 3 that I mentioned. And then throughout history, great technology changes, big changes, such as the industrial revolutions. And of course, we are going through those types of changes with AI and other forms of technology changes that are having and will have revolutionary effects. So I call that, the big 5. So that's a typical cycle, and you have to watch it and give whatever thought and credence to that you think is appropriate. But let me touch on the big 5. By my calculations and understanding the mechanics of the creation of debt, the creation of debt for individuals or companies and governments is all the same except for one big difference, in which that is the government's ability to print money to pay debt. In other words, debt is an obligation to pay back money. And if that system works well, there's a reward. Interest rates are high enough to be good for the lender who becomes the creditor. That lender-creditor can have a high enough interest rate that they get a good return from that lending, and that the borrower doesn't have such a high interest rate that is crushing for them financially. And the more debt rises relative to income, the more difficult that is. So the debts that have been accumulated, and large debts are projected, particularly in the United States, but this is now a world phenomenon. There's simply not enough money to go around. So for all the social programs, military, and other things, there is therefore the progression of debt continuing to rise relative to incomes, which is setting itself up for a challenge. Central banks, by buying the debt, have taken on their balance sheets. And so that is a risky situation which evolves over time. It's not the most immediate situation, but it'll certainly be affected by the other things that are going on. All of 5 of these, by the way, affect each other. So the interrelationship in creating that cycle is important. Okay, the second is the internal conflict. And of course, that is the highlight of this year. How will particularly the elections in the United States go? There are 2 questions related to that. Will the elections be accepted by both sides? And what are the consequences of that? We honestly don't know the answer. There are reasons for concern, and I'll leave that to you. But there are also very big differences between the policies of what would be a Trump administration and what would be a Democratic administration, particularly the issue of left-right. Both parties have moderates and have extremists, and in both cases, there will be likely conflict between the extremists. And so in the Trump presidency, you're getting much more of a nationalistic, isolationist, protectionist type of policies that are of the right and are likely to offer more protections to those who have larger amounts of money, the wealthy and the corporations. And of course, on the left, most of those policies are somewhat different, but the one thing that there's broad agreement on is I would say, anti-China policies. So in 2024, we are going to learn a lot about these and what the policies will be. The third influence, of the great power conflict is something that you all see up close. And both countries, the United States and China, have their own sets of challenges. In China's case, there is, of course, the real estate creating the debt issues and the economic issues coming from that. And as President Xi said, there's an approaching 1 in a 100-year storm on the horizon. And there are domestic issues. Climate, of course, is a big issue, has always been for China. And there are those financial issues and taking more of a top-down, more autocratic type of approach to consolidating the power and operating from the top. And then, of course, in the United States, we have the internal conflict and the problems we just spoke about. And of course, that has enormous implications for the world, because if you read history, you see that the economic warfare precedes military warfare. I can't comment. I have no particular inside information regarding military conflict. You all see the situation. I believe it's most likely that there's not an imminent form of military conflict, but we do have a situation, of course, with Taiwan, that there is a one China policy, and that will not go on forever. And so that has created a set of circumstances now in which there are questions. There are questions from international investors about whether they will experience consequences that could come from their governments. For example, American investors investing in China could experience from their government negative consequences for that. And then there's also the worry from the Chinese side could make that challenging. And then there's the raising of issues, of the ideological issues. Let's say in China, is it still glorious to be rich? What does the continuation of market economy, how is that going to work? And how does property protections work? And how are the issues about common prosperity? What does that all look like? And so that's an evolutionary set of circumstances which you're exposed to and creates risks and issues and even capital flows that change the world landscape. For example, Chinese producers producing outside of China, and not only in the ASEAN countries like Vietnam and the like, but also in countries like Mexico. And how does that all work? That's changing the landscape. And of course, there's a great risk of economic sanctions, an exchange of economic sanctions that would be really terrible for the world. So there's risks behind that. At the same time, Chinese assets are very attractively priced, and we've done very well. Bridgewater has done very well over the last 5 years of operating in there. And so there's certainly effective ways to make investments in China. And then we come to the fourth influence, which is the climate issue. And there's particularly climate, droughts, floods, and pandemics, which have been incredibly deterministic and influential in China. And so at a minimum, this is going to be very financially costly in one way or another, either to try to keep climate temperature levels rising to 1.5 degrees and inventing new technologies, or paying for the damages that occur from it, or building infrastructure to protect oneself around that, seawalls and other things. It costs estimated cost, $8 trillion a year. That $8 trillion a year worldwide is equivalent to about 8% of world GDP. It's certainly going to be a disruptor, and it'll change migration patterns, and it'll have big, big effects. And of course, number 5, as I said, was technology. And in my opinion, we are going right now through the greatest industrial revolution changes. You know, when I look at history, and I think the power of the printing press in being able to have knowledge pass, and when knowledge could be built on and shared, what an incredible invention. And then, of course, we went from the agricultural age to the industrial age, in which man learned that machines could replace people doing a lot of different things. And that created, of course, a great economic boom. And of course, we have had the digital revolution that's gone on, that's included all that, all its various ways that you're well acquainted with. And of course, this technology revolution, AI, when you start to thinking touches everything, and the capacity to either supplement one's thinking or to do work that could have been less effectively done at more costs by people, and the productivity impact, but also technology, it could be used for war. It's a fabulous tool, and we're entering an era that we really can't fully anticipate. So those 5 forces are interdependent on each other and will influence, but it's a period that we're entering into of greater risk. And the main thing I would emphasize is the need for effective diversification. So if I was to leave you with some messages, the messages would be that the power of diversification is greater than the power of even good decision making, because you can improve your return to risk ratio by a factor of 5 if you can find good uncorrelated return streams. And when we think about diversification means diversification of countries, diversification of asset classes, diversification of currencies, and so broader diversification. I can't take the time to take you through really the structural ways of being able to diversify well, but I would also emphasize some big picture tactical considerations. Basically, there are 3 things that I look for in countries, and I suppose to some extent I look for it also in corporations, countries, and people in terms of managing their finances. And so here they are. First, does the country as a whole earn more than it spends? So does it have a good income statement and a balance sheet so that it has the financial capabilities of dealing with the issues at hand? The second is an environment that is conducive for healthy competition and working together to create great productivity through great leadership and great productivity. And number 3, is it a country that is at risk of a war, to be caught between countries in a war? I studied markets behavior in wars, And there are three types of countries. Those countries that are the winners, those that are the losers in the war, and those that are neutral in the war. And it turns out that those that are neutral in the war do better than the winners of the war, who still pay a terrible cost, financially as well as in loss of life and destruction. And then, of course, the worst is the losers of the war, who lose everything. My main point is that in thinking about what is the financial health of a country, how well do they work together to be productive together, and are they at risk of a conflict that would be disruptive to all of that? So that's what I look at when I'm thinking about diversification. I think about diversification of asset classes.